like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's like this old time.
All right, Harry Robinson, welcome back to the J.Burden Show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great, thanks. Thanks for having me back on, Jay.
Yeah, I mean, I always enjoy our conversations. It's helpful because I see things from your country that I find confusing. And there's an immense amount of just absolute anti-British slop on the internet that is just not worth engaging. And so, when I have a question like, what in the world are UK politicians doing? I always prefer to have a Brit on. And yeah, you're one of my favorite British correspondents. I always appreciate your input. And
Thank you.
I figure let's just jump into it. Do you want to explain the background of this show, Adolescence? Why it matters more than any just generic slop on Netflix? And why your government has gotten so obsessed with it?
Well, so for a lot of people, Adolescence, or well, at least for me, Adolescence kind of sprang up out of nowhere. You know the way that certain news stories will appear from the ether, and all of a sudden it's the main headlines for everything. That's kind of what happened for me with Adolescence, and that's how it's kind of, you get the sniff test of this seems like a coordinated effort to push something and to push a mainstream narrative onto the people. Oftentimes, especially in the case of the British government, to justify new censorious laws that the government's been trying to push for a long while. For instance, the online safety bill is something that the government has been trying to push for a very, very long time, and they always are looking for new ways to justify it. And oftentimes, that will be in the way of new television programs, because one of the best ways to program people's fear response is to show them fiction of a ridiculous scenario happening that justifies these new measures that the government wants to put in place, because people always respond better to fiction than they do real news stories, or at least that's the way the government would prefer it be. Like the riots that happened following the Axel Ruder-Cabana murders of a number of white girls last year at the end of July in Southport. That was something where the main driving agitation for most people was the fact that this was a foreigner from Rwandan background, and the media were trying to push that he was Welsh because he had been born in Wales, even though both of his parents were immigrants over into the country. But the media were trying to push that he was Welsh. The media hid for a long time that he had got terrorist material on his computer. They also hid for a long time that he'd been trying to manufacture ricin in his home, and that he was also somebody who had been involved in numerous violent altercations at the school that he'd been going to as well, and before he committed these murders. And this is where most people would say, well, what's happening here is another case of the failure of the complete and abject failure of integration, where we've been importing these hostile people into the country. And what the government and the media turns around and says, what this is a problem of male hatred of women. This is a problem of people's access to the internet. This is a problem of incels, etc., etc., etc. So therefore, you need to push these laws to censor social media further. And when the riots and the protests happened last year, the police were going around picking up people who were just standing around near the protests or at the protests off of the pavement, not actually doing anything, just so that they could inflate the numbers of arrests, and then putting them through these sped up trials, actively taking criminals out of the prisons to allow for this new flow of otherwise peaceful people who were just annoyed, angry, justifiably angry at the fact that the government had failed them yet again, putting these people in prison instead. And that relates to this show Adolescence, because this show Adolescence is promoting itself as being about knife crime and being about the dangers of incel violence, another story telling young men that if they identify with somebody like Andrew Tate or identify with his message. Because personally, I don't like Andrew Tate at all. I think that he is a provocateur. I also think that he is an Islamist. I know he's an Islamist, and he's explicitly said that he thinks the UK would be better off if we were all Islamic as well, which is not a message I stand by. I also am not huge on the whole red pill manosphere thing, or at least as the way that he presents it. A very controversial figure. Also not a fan of the whole, like cam business that he was running in Romania either. There's a lot to complain about with him. But they're trying to pin him and the kind of message that he spreads to young men about identifying with yourself, becoming strong, messages that are otherwise positive for young men who are otherwise disenfranchised. They're trying to pin this spate of night crime on him and influencers like him, and they're using this to push increasingly censorious government bills through, like the online safety bill. And just to exemplify this, so Good Morning Britain is one of the top news shows in the country that people tune into, or at least boomers and Gen Xers tune into in the mornings. And just this morning, there's been a report on there saying a new report into last summer's riots that followed the Southport attacks has found the violent unrest was fueled by social media activity and suggests a dedicated police force to monitor and respond to social media posts at a national level. Now, Morgoth shared that, and Morgoth had the pretty reasonable take of, actually, I thought it was the murders committed by a foreigner of young girls that actually spurred this on. But the media don't want to address that. His trial, especially at the beginning of this year, was very strange. Very, very strange. Because he went into court, rescinded his not guilty pleas, and pled guilty to everything all at once. And there'd been rumors spreading about his involvement with this, about the fact that the Prevent, which is a government department that is supposed to prevent terror attacks, had already known about him for a very, very long time. People like Nigel Farage were suggesting that this was going to unearth some very controversial stuff to do with our current government, the Keir Starmer Labour government, that would have completely toppled it. It would have changed UK politics, British politics forever. And then instead of actually going through a proper trial, people presenting evidence, us learning more of the story that would have been potentially headline news for weeks, he just goes straight to prison, which seems very, very strange to me. So, yeah, that's a lot of the stuff that's going on in Britain at the moment, and it's not great because all of it is seemingly geared toward further centralization, further control of people's access to information, mainly because the government wants a complete monopoly on it.
Well, and to put it mildly, that situation is remarkably convenient for the people in power, right? Where this is, from their perspective, a very uncomfortable event. It has highlighted certain tensions that cannot be allowed to be highlighted. And so shuffling this under the rug, right? Oh, he's in prison, no further investigation needed, is obviously particularly helpful. To go back to your point about the sort of predictive programming, I don't want to necessarily adopt the kind of like conspiratorial lens here, but the idea that certain narratives are broadly spread through fiction. And in the US, you saw this with the whole Me Too thing, right? So the Hollywood casting couch is an infamous motif. And to be honest, it seems to be largely justified. But if you look at something, for instance, like the Duke Lacrosse case, where you have a group of young men have their lives completely ruined, made it impossible for them to get a career, and it turns out to be entirely fake. Well, the question is, okay, why did the public jump to that conclusion? Well, some of it is journalists are scum, right? We can just say that. But another is that is a message, that is a narrative that has been seeded for years in film and television, right? The idea of, the entitled rich kid who, basically, assaults a woman and says, no one will ever believe you because XYZ. And in that, right, there is a certain amount of, I guess, deliberate programming, right? These are the people, these acceptable targets are the reason for XYZ social ill. And I think it's a very useful tactic because, of course, in another system, we can imagine saying, well, aren't the people in charge responsible for these things? They have the levers of power. And if you can move that onto, as the communists did, right, the wreckers, right, they're the reason that this social program isn't working. It's a very useful tool. Similarly, in the UK, if you have shifted knife violence, which, I realize on the scale of American crime is not a massive issue, but comparatively, right, England went from being a very safe place to a much less safe place. Well, that obviously begs the question of who allowed this to happen? Who is doing this? And let's just say with a mild amount of noticing, you could come to very uncomfortable conclusions from the perspective of your regime. And if you recast that, right, you can say, oh, it's not us. It's not our fault. It's not our clients. It's Andrew Tate, the people, the person everyone loves to hate, this kind of totem of misogynist evil. And again, I share your opinions on Tate. He's not even a particularly unique, like, shock jockey. It basically Dan Bilzerian Part 2. And we've seen this character before.
Yeah, he's a hustler.
Exactly. He's a low IQ gangster. Not simply, there's nothing more to it. And I'm not trying to defend him at all. But he exists, it seems like, in a similar position to someone like Richard Spencer, where he is the man the regime loves to hate. They love to keep him around because he fits their narrative perfectly. And he is a justification for what they want done. Do you see what I'm getting at there, Harry?
Absolutely. We have another figure like that over here who is one of the most controversial figures in Britain. But whenever he goes over to America, he just becomes another talking head on American podcasts, interestingly enough. And that is Tommy Robinson, who is really, when you examine his beliefs and his politics, one of the most, milquetoast, center-right types that you could imagine. But because of his early involvement with the EDL and the way that the media smeared them back in 2011 when they first formed, he has become persona non grata. And he is the eternal boogeyman that the government loves to bring out whenever they want to let off some steam. If they want it so that everybody can go and do a big useless protest in London, that Tommy Robinson's going to make sure that he's going to form a big new useless protest in London that will achieve nothing. And then if something like the riots last year happen, he will be among many different figures who are named alongside people like Andrew Tate as being the reason for all of these tensions that have emerged in the country. It's nothing to do with community breakdown due to ethnic enclaves being formed in this country, the importing of millions of people who are from very different backgrounds, very different cultures, very different behaviors and ways of life than us. It's all to do with the fact that people like Tommy Robinson stir up the white gammon to make sure that they want to go out and hurt these otherwise poor, innocent diversities that we've brought into our country. And on that as well, when you're talking about the predictive programming, the way the media likes to spin this, when you talk about who's committing the knife crime in the country, just to make it as clear as possible for people, the Mayor of London office has explicitly put out a number of PSAs, done a number of commissions and studies into this, where they've gone out of their way to say that knife crime in London, disproportionately to the tune of about 62%, is committed by and affects the diverse black population of London, which shows that they know where it's coming from. They know who's committing it. A lot of it is committed by drill rap gangs, which I've done a bit of work looking into, which is interesting because they go online, they post songs about how they're about to commit crimes, and then they cry when they commit those crimes and get taken into court, and the lyrics of them saying the crimes that they have committed is used as evidence against them. And of course, there's a human rights lawyer always waiting in the wings to say how unfair it is to use this admission of their own guilt as an admission of guilt for them in a court of law, which is hilarious. But with them, it's not only that they disproportionately commit the crimes and then they brag about it. There's been many reports about it in the news for a long time. They even have a website that you can go to that shows the different locations of the drill gangs and how they operate and where they operate, the names of them. So this is stuff that's well known, Everybody knows what's going on, whether or not the Lib Dem class, the middle classes, the Labour voters like to acknowledge it. But then all of a sudden, Adolescence comes along, and who is the kid in the show who's 13 years old, who has committed the knife crime, who's killed this poor young girl? He's just a 13-year-old white kid, which people have been very angry when people have pointed out that this does not reflect demographic reality. But the fact of the matter is, this show is being boosted, it's being promoted to spread a message in the mainstream media. It's headlines everywhere. You have numerous incidences now of Kemi Badenoch, who I'm not a particularly big fan of, who is the head of the Conservative Party of Britain, being grilled in a very Soviet Checker-style manner on LBC, on the BBC, about why she's not watched it yet. And fair enough to her, she said that she's got enough on her plate worrying about real things that are actually happening in the world without having to watch some Netflix fiction program and use that to develop policy. Keir Starmer, our current prime minister, explicitly called it a documentary. It was a slip, but he met with the creators of the program and spoke to them at Downing Street, had a roundtable with them, and also another group, a women's violence group called Tender, and he accidentally called it a documentary, which I think is a very telling slip-up because it shows the mindset that these elites are approaching it with, that this is a reflection of reality, or at least they desperately want it to be a reflection of reality so that they can justify their own draconian laws that they want to use to censor everybody. Now, the interesting thing is I've not actually watched Adolescence. I have no interest in doing such a thing, to be honest, because I have better, like Kemi Badenoch, ironically enough, I have better things to do with my time than watch the latest bit of government programming. But Carl has watched it, and he said that the interesting thing about the story is you end up feeling very sympathetic towards the young boy who's the murderer, because the only reason he killed this girl in the show is because she was the ringleader of a group of all of the students in his school who were cyberbullying him, who were making fun of him, humiliating him regularly, and then she confronts him, and he, overwhelmed by the situation, ends up going into a rage, grabbing a knife, and stabbing her to death. So you end up feeling somewhat sympathetic to him, according to Carl, as well as the fact that afterwards, the father, you feel very sympathetic for him, and you're kind of overwhelmed by this very feminine, very feelings-based world order that he's found himself in, because he has nothing that he can do. He, as the father, is completely failed, but he wasn't given the opportunity to succeed in the first place. And that's all very interesting because it goes to show how some of the narratives that the show wants to push might be countered by the facts of the narrative that it's presenting to you. But also, I think it kind of works as a two-pronged attack here, because you have one end where the government and the media are pushing this narrative as the Andrew Tate show. Isn't it terrible that young men have access to Andrew Tate and other influencers online who are going to push them into this woman-hating mentality? And then you get people like Carl watch it, who then turn around and says, yeah, it's terrible what happened to this girl, but it's also terrible what happened to this boy, because all of these people had access to social media, all of these kids had access to social media, and they were able to cyberbully him, single him out, and humiliate him. Now, I think there might be something more to the nuance that's being presented here, because what's actually being presented is a narrative that's very, very attractive to conservatives as well. Now, there's a lot of nuance on the question of whether young people below the age of 18 or 16, whatever you want to say, should have access to social media and phones in the first place. But what they're being presented is a narrative that's kind of prepackaged for them that says, well, of course we should have some kind of law to prevent kids having access to social media, because otherwise this kind of cyberbullying that could happen, and you could end up being the dad who's suffering because his son was bullied to the point where he ends up seeing red and killing someone. But when they present that narrative, that's not just what would get passed. You wouldn't just get a single law that said no one below the age of 16 could have access to a smartphone and Facebook and Twitter. It gets packaged in with all of the other censorious laws that would be passed in a bill like the online safety bill. So that's something that I've been thinking about since Carl has been speaking to me about the narrative that he was able to perceive through the show. What do you think to that?
Yeah, so I think that this is something we often see the regime doing, which is deliberately create a sort of false binary with opposition built into it. So, for instance, a great example is a lot of the LGBTQ nonsense in the US, specifically as regards trans women in women's sports. That ostensibly those people are fighting over, transgender athletes, but effectively what they're doing is enshrining 1970s feminism. Or you've got the conservatives in America defending Title IX, right? Sort of like frog marching people along. And I think that, that built-in response of, if you see yourself as either the kind of therapeutic arm of the state in, this young boy's therapist, or the father, in either case, the appropriate quote unquote narrative response within the story they're telling you is the same, which is, pass this censorious bill. It's sort of built into it. And I hadn't noticed that explicitly, but that's a very conniving piece of propaganda that you have sort of taken into account and already built in a release valve in the direction of something you already wanted to begin with. You're setting up your opposition to failure, which, when we talk about either Cthulhu swimming left, or the kind of ratchet and prawl, whatever analogy you want to use for this slow drift towards entropy, the slow drift towards the left, I mean, that is the mechanism by which it's done.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's clear to me now that I've been thinking about it that the way that it sneaks it in is that the message that's being presented to lots of people through the mainstream headlines is show where Andrew Tate is guilty because kid ends up murdering a girl. Isn't it terrible about all of these incels? They know by now that we on the alternative media sphere tend to get a lot of mileage out of reacting to mainstream headlines and trying to counter their own narratives. And so the play seems to be present the mainstream narrative this way, but have it so that the actual show, and the people who made the show might not be aware that this is what they're doing, but it seems to all wrap together quite nicely. Have it so that the show itself is nuanced enough that a conservative, in the same way that Carl and others did with Barbie, remember the Barbie movie and people saying, oh, actually it was based, they can go into it and rationalize and read their own narrative out of it, which still wraps back around into supporting the online safety bill. So I do think it is quite insidious in that way, and it shows that they are quite clever. This is not something that I believe the Conservatives would have been able to pull off, mainly because the Conservatives were genuinely useless and incompetent. But what we have at the moment under Keir Starmer is a very Blairite government. AA has spoken about this quite a lot, talking about how, to begin with, Starmer's government was a series of absolute failures in terms of PR. He had Southport riots, and he absolutely failed to control the narratives that were being put forward with that. If he'd been able to control the narratives, we wouldn't have had the riots in the first place. But he did such a bad job of managing perception that you ended up with the riots. And then you had the farmers' protests, and then you had the elderly fuel tax that was being that was being removed at the end of last year as well, which meant that old people who didn't have any other source of income except for their pensions might not have been able to fuel their heating over the winter, and winters can get very, very cold over here. So there was a lot of worry about that as well. So it was a series of PR disasters, one after the other. And slowly, as the government has been progressing, it seems that a lot of the people behind the scenes have been moving positions, and you've got more Blairites behind the scenes, because Starmer was originally a Blair guy. seemed to abandon him, try to make his own way during his first few months as prime minister, and now all of a sudden has decided to adopt the Blairite stuff because guess what? It works. Blair, as much as I do think that he's an evil person with bad intentions who set off a lot of the domino effect that's led to the country to where it is today, he is savvy. He's a very, very savvy political operator, and he knows how things work. He's conniving, and he's good at management and PR perception. And so Starmer has been adopting a lot of that. And what do you get? You get much more effective media management, much more effective perception management. You know, it's been such a saturated narrative with adolescence that a few weeks ago I went to the dentist. I know, haha, British people going to the dentist. What's the point? We do it. We do go to the dentists, all right? And while I was sat in the chair, he starts talking to me and he goes, "Oh, have you watched Adolescence yet?" And this is kind of the narrative, the media line as well, which is you need to watch Adolescence. If you haven't watched it yet, you need to watch it. It's been presented to Kemi Badenoch and a load of other people as if it's their political and patriotic duty to watch Adolescence. And if you don't do it, what was it, Femi, who's just a horrible, horrible political commenter on our side of the aisle, on the other side of the aisle, said, honestly, any UK politician who hasn't watched Adolescence at this point, unless they have the excuse of personal trauma, doesn't give an F about our society. Again, this is a piece of fiction. This is a piece of fiction, and apparently if you haven't watched it, you're not doing your duty to society. But the interesting thing as well with this dentist's interaction that I had was that he didn't talk to me about any of the narrative to do with it. He didn't speak to me about all the media and how it was blowing up and all that. He just wanted to talk about how fancy it was that they managed to make it look like the whole thing was done in one take. Each episode is presented as though it's one big long take, which was interesting to me that he hadn't picked up on anything. But also I think that's another part of how they have gotten quite fancy and insidious with the messaging and the message crafting, is because the more you are swept up by the technical aspects of it, the less you're paying attention to the narrative. Well, you are still paying attention to it, just on a more subconscious level. It makes you easier to propagandize in that way because you'll just sit down, switch off, and let the message flow into you without even realizing it. But that I found was funny that even my dentist wanted to speak to me about it.
Well, and that's a sort of bizarre situation when something kind of jumps from being a topic of political conversation to it hits the zeitgeist, and everyone is expected to have an action or a reaction. The details aren't entirely the same, but do you remember? It's actually funny. This is exactly why I got off normie social media and have never returned. Do you remember in the summer of Floyd when the black squares were going around?
Oh God, don't remind me. I still, every so often, I'll be going on Instagram and they'll do the suggested following, and I'll see, an old friend I've not seen in a while. Let's see what they've been up to. And you'll scroll through and there'll be a black square there somewhere. They've still got them up.
Yeah, but the reason I bring it up, right, is because I had a similar reaction or a similar interaction to Badenoch, where effectively I had someone who was very annoyed with me for not posting, right? It was seen as by failing to engage, you're making some sort of political statement, which, let's be honest, is that was accurate, right? They weren't entirely wrong.
I mean, that is true, but it goes to show the over politicization of our society. Frankly, a lot of plebs, and I include myself in this, shouldn't feel the need to have to comment on everything that happens in our society and have an opinion. If for one reason or another, I mean, obviously it's my job to be able to comment on these things now, but most people have jobs, they've got lives. It's kind of overwhelming for a lot of people to be forced to have opinions on all of these different societal matters at the same time. I quite take the Evola position on that, which is it's cruel and unfair on a lot of these people.
Well, and this is a take that I stole from Timeline Earth. But the news should be a capital offense. Like, you should just not, most people should not know. And I count myself in this number, what happens. It does them, it does them no good. But in all seriousness, one of the other things I want to bring up is the degree to which feminism is sort of baked into the UK establishment, deliberately using that term, of course, because there's a famous John Lennon song about women, which I cannot quote, but there's a degree to which it's kind of true about the UK, that in the US, the primary social issue for which everything is tied back to is racial matters, right? Regardless of your opinion one way or another, racism is, the defining kind of like left-wing social push, and everything else is talked about in relation to that. Whereas from what I see of your politics, it seems as if that is feminism. Every issue is related to women in some way. First, is that an accurate characterization? And two, why do you think that is the case?
I think it's a partially accurate characterization. Certainly, feminism is pretty big over here. It tends to be women's issues that tend to get headlines. I would say that we also have our own racial narratives that are going on now. We've got the post-colonial narrative. We've got the narrative on reparations. I think you've got your own narrative on reparations. So you get a lot of people in our society who go to the newspapers, and maybe someone like Lenny Henry, who's a black comedian who came up in the 80s. He makes his career in the 80s being the kind of non-offensive black guy that you could imagine yourself being friends with. He's a funny guy. He comes across nice enough. Now he's talking about reparations. So we're starting to get those narratives over here now, even though we had our own story with slavery, where we, as part of the empire in the early 19th century, went and abolished the slave trade across all of our empire, and then tried to abolish slave trade across the world. That doesn't matter. We had our own kind of BLM thing. They constantly try to create our British George Floyd to justify it. But during the summer of Floyd, we also had university students in some of our major cities taking to the streets, even though the George Floyd incident had nothing to do with us in the first place. So we have a lot of that. But yeah, feminization, feminism is one of the big things as well. It's one of the main narratives that gets used to push these kinds of things, mainly women's safety online, women's ability to be criticized online, obviously a terrible thing. Even the way that adolescence is being presented, I said this on the podcast the other week when I was talking about it with Carl, is a very feminized way of presenting the narrative. Within the narrative itself, obviously, it's a very feminist society that we're being presented, where he's committed this horrible crime, the kid, and all of the people, all of his teachers, all of the social workers, all of the people that he's speaking to about this are women, and the father is basically shut out of the whole process, which is one of the things that makes him feel quite a lot of despair. But also just the way the narrative is being presented. I said what it is. You'll know this. We all know this. Anybody who's ever had a long-term relationship will know this feeling. It is, you wake up in bed next to your missus and she's angry at you for no reason. And you ask why. And she says that you, in a dream, did something terrible to her. You cheated on me. In my dream I had. Oh, you were so mean to me. In this dream I had. You left me for no reason. In this dream I had. Adolescence is that. Adolescence is the elite coming up with some story that they dreamt up one day to be angry at us about, which means that now we've got to make it up to them. Do you understand what I'm saying there? I think you'll
Exactly.
have had that.
Yeah, exactly. Right, where the people like you and I are forced to defend this in some way, right? It's like, why did you do this? And again, as you mentioned earlier, people like you and I didn't do this, right? It's something else. But through the recasting of that narrative, it turns it from an attack on a friend of the regime to an attack on the enemy. And so, transforming this problem into a solution. Similarly, you see this with Jan 6, right?
Mm.
That you have the entire Summer of Love, an immense amount of, shall we say, fiery but peaceful protests. And what does the narrative of 2020 become? I guess 2021, right? It becomes, a bunch of boomers milling around in the Capitol, which then becomes, the way in which democracy was almost overthrown in America. We were this close to, a fascist regime. And
it was
all of
terrible.
that,
People don't know democracy was actually held in that podium that guy almost ran off with. So he almost literally stole democracy. It was awful.
it's true. It is democracy is communicated through two things, which is one, how much your country allows butt sex, and then two, whether or not they possess a podium. And that's really the only two building blocks, as I've been reliably informed.
I mean, I'm pretty sure that's what the founding fathers intended. Interestingly, on this whole concept of democracy, my former colleague now, Connor Tomlinson, was releasing some video clips on his Twitter page earlier on today, where he'd been involved in some discussion on democracy, Gen Z's feeling about the future of this country, why they're not feeling as confident in democracy as previous generations did. And one of the people that he was debating with was asked what democracy is and why he's so in favor of it. Not once in his answer does he mention anything to do with the will of the people, majority voting, anything to do with that, as in representative democracy being the majority of the people want this, they elect representatives who actually legitimately represent them and make the things that they want to happen. Nothing to do with that, because as we know, what democracy actually is basically the exact opposite, which is the plebs are considered too evil and bigoted and backwards to ever get what they want, because if you do give them what they want, then you're literally Hitler. Instead, all he named was things like the NHS, institutions, university education, things like this, which are, to me, abstract constructs that these people always point to. They always point to institutions without recognizing that it's people that make up those institutions. And even then, yes, there are institutions that are kind of baked into democracy to allow for the democratic process to happen. But democracy at its core was supposed to be ruled by the people, for the people, of the people, etc., etc. And so it's funny how, again, the elites show time and time again that they do not care about the wishes of the people, mainly because they want to manipulate them and force them into believing what they want to believe so that they can be led better. And that ties into the next thing, which is, as much as this new government has been a lot better at perception management than the previous government, because again, the Tories were clowns. They legitimately were some of the most incompetent fools to ever be in Westminster. There is still the problem of, well, you have imported this enormous hostile population into our country. You actively go out of your way to ignore the wishes of the people who can trace their ancestry back here thousands of years, like I can. You've gone out of your way to disenfranchise them. Young men feel as though they have no hope and no future. The economy is terrible. There are all of these problems. So young men and even some of the older generations are beginning to see that and are beginning to opt out of the system. So the problem goes, well, how do you solve that? And with adolescents, what they have decided to do is, well, we've got to get them when they're even younger, which is why, as part of this roundtable I mentioned earlier, where Keir Starmer met up with the creators of Adolescence, it was decided and publicized that it's going to be part of classes in schools now. So you get them when they're even younger. And just to be sure, and on the feminist point as well, a lot of these will be guided by women who will be the teachers of these young boys. So you will get the propaganda, and then you will get a guide to tell you how you're supposed to interpret and understand the propaganda. And as part of that, there is a group called Tender, who I mentioned, who were also part of that roundtable, who were a big part of the publicizing this television show. They did a screening of it on the day that it was released with Netflix. They are very, very, as I say, heavily involved in this. They receive income from government grants. They've received about £3.4 million in taxpayer funding between 2020 and 2024. I'm referring to the work of Charlotte Gill here for a lot of this, because she did a decent amount of work looking into this and publicizing it on Twitter. Very, very interesting. Now, I believe that they are a women's violence charity, obviously anti-women's violence. So it's understandable that they would be involved in this. They're the ones preparing the class materials for the classes that will be based around the showings of Adolescence. And as part of this, she unearthed a lot of their materials that they had produced before, including a pyramid of male violence. And it starts off in the lower reaches of the pyramid. At the bottom of the pyramid, you have things like catcalling, bragging, locker room talk, things like that, slut shaming, yada, yada, yada. And at the top of the pyramid, there is genocide. So it's very clumsy, and it might get made fun of. And I would like to be a fly on the wall in these classrooms where they're going to be shown Adolescence and be guided through these materials, where they're going to be told, listen, if you engage in locker room talk, if you engage in banter with your male friends, you're only a few steps away from being a genocidal maniac. I would love to be a fly on the wall, but this is how desperate they're getting. They're pairing up with government-funded charities who seem to have had a lot of a big hand in Adolescence. I would imagine they consulted on Adolescence, which basically means that this is a government project at this point, as much as that was already obvious. And they want to push this on the kids as early as possible so that they can remove themselves from their toxic masculinity, because that makes them much easier to control that way.
Well, and we've seen this playbook run before. There are other, and I'm going to have to be delicate here because this is truly the third rail, right? There are other...
Leap on, my friend, leap on.
Yeah, why not? When you look at World War II movies, for instance, and which of those are shown in schools?
What did you get shown in school? So I got shown the what was it? The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. That was the one that we got shown when we were growing up.
So I missed that just due to that was quite common. Schindler's List is another popular one in Christian schools. You'll either read, and I can't remember if there's a movie or not, or if I'm just confabulating that. Corrie ten Boom's The Hiding Place or Anne Frank's Diary, right? And all of those are, again, they are created, they produce a narrative. And in humans being mimetic creatures, that narrative works in deeper than a list of statistics. That kind of emotive connection. And to me, I see there being a similar danger in this, where the fictionalized narrative becomes what matters. Right? That's what hits the culture. And so the actual events, much like I believe it was Baudrillard's point about the Gulf War, right, effectively never happened. The narrative has become what is actually relevant. And obviously, humans are inherently biased. There is no neutral institution. So you get this in everything. But when it's such a deliberately destructive ideological point being presented, that, incels are the wreckers of society. Incels are the reason that you are unsafe. Incels are the reason that, XYZ social ill exists. And you're burning that in at a very young age. I mean, it's incredibly, incredibly sinister. And I want to actually speak about incel as a term, because Carl made this point that this character we follow is 13 years old. And is there any 13-year-old who isn't, by the literal definition, an incel? Right? Is the
they
solution
should
to
be,
this?
right?
Yeah, exactly. Is the solution to, ship every 13-year-old in the country down to, Rotterdam or, out behind a sketchy car park, right? It's like,
Yeah,
no, this is,
we organise a school trip in year 9 to Amsterdam where they can all go down the red light district. No, that's a terrible
it's
idea.
monstrous, right? It's obviously absurd. But that term has completely departed from its original meaning. Effectively, it means a man whom women do not like, which is why you get things like, Elon Musk is an incel. And I
He's got 12 kids.
was about to
something
say,
like that. He's
have
got loads of kids.
there are few people who fit that term less than Elon Musk, right? Who seems to have impregnated a number of women that would, I don't know, make Genghis Khan blush, right? But again, the point is
and
not
we all
literally.
saw him post that picture of Amber Heard. He's got receipts.
Yeah. And again, the point in that term is not, literally, men who cannot find women and feel frustrated are the problem, but to say non-compliant men, right? Men who have not indexed with the therapeutic state, whatever you want to call it. And I think that the framing of the show, where you have, this murderer and his therapist kind of going back and forth, is really interesting. And this is a point that E. Michael Jones, who's a man that I have complicated feelings on, has made. But he basically says that.
Do you like his feelings on Polish people and who can be Polish?
Actually, I really I disavow every statement E. Michael Jones has ever made about a certain ethno-sectarian group, but I just like him for his comments about Mexicans.
I've not heard his comments about this. I'm going to have to look for those now after this.
Oh, they're kind of goofy. Basically, he's like an unironic believer in castizo-futurism, where he basically sees like South America. I think he used the term star children, right, for being the perfect combination of Catholic culture, which, I don't have anything against Spanish people.
No.
But,
I go on holiday quite a bit to Spain. It's a lovely country. Never been to Mexico though.
There's a little bit of a difference there.
I guess.
I'll put it this way. I think 8 out of the top 10 most murderous cities in America or in the world are in Mexico. So, Dr. Jones might be a little wrong there, but point is,
well, I mean, my only exposure of Mexico is through shows like Breaking Bad, so I can believe it.
Yeah, between that and Live Leak, I think he pretty much got it. But he makes this point that therapy is the inverted confession ritual of our modern state religion. That you are conforming yourself to, the state faith, right? The joke, right? The classic post is therapy is just talking to a libtard until you agree with them. And again, we see both the political angle, right? That you were being told, how to act, you were confessing your sins to a accredited expert of the state and told how to react, right? Which things are the result of your original sin, right? Your trauma, which things are, problematic, and which things you need to accept, which is, again, in application, effectively an inversion of traditional Western Christian morality. But also, right, there is a level to which that is basically a feminine form. And there's nothing wrong with the feminine, right? It is half of the human experience, but it is not universally suited. It is a different mode of, and again, I hate therapy talk, but of processing, right? That is how women tend to do that. And while there's nothing wrong with that, saying that is the cure, right? That incels need to go to therapy. You see this in how leftist women talk all the time, right? Go to therapy, or I want a man in therapy, where it is this idea of, of basically kneeling to the state, that is the solution for these unconquered men, right? Who make up the quote unquote, right, regime incel.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And when you talk about that, Carl again brings up this point, which is that the regime treats men, especially young boys, not like men, but like they're defective women. You're expected to hold yourself to feminine standards at all times. You can't resolve problems through action, through determination, through an expression of willpower. You have to solve them through expressing them verbally, through working through them that way, which just doesn't work for most boys. This is why it's such a meme of the whole gym culture. Oh, I'm feeling depressed, guys. What should I do? You should hit the gym and you should lift some weight. And that's the truth. As much as it's a cliche, as much as it's not going to solve all of your problems, it will make you feel better. And it'll make women feel better as well. They just don't like to be told that because they think you're calling them a fat. And that's I think one of the really terrible things about adolescence, again, thinking about it in the way that Carl has described the narrative, because what it's showing you is this world in which you are destined to be trapped. You have no agency in this situation if you are the father. If you're the father, you have no agency in this. If you are the young boy, the only agency that you had to express yourself was to kill this girl, which has landed you in this trouble and is terrible in itself anyway. Whereas what the state wants to prefer is, well, you're being cyberbullied, you go to the state, you go to therapy. You're the dad who's in this hopeless situation, you go to therapy. You talk about it. You don't commit actions, you talk about it. So it's presenting this deterministic, hopeless situation and presenting the state's premeditated offer, what the only thing that the state can offer to you, which is therapy, the therapeutic state, as the only solution to it. So it's quite awful in that way as well, because the original sin, in a similar way to the original sin that's being presented in Schindler's List, which I've never watched in full, because honestly, and I hope the comments don't get angry at me for this, it's a ridiculous film. It's a very, very ridiculous film. The original sin that's being presented through Schindler's List and the reason that it's pushed in classrooms, the reason that the boy in the striped pajama and other Holocaust narratives are pushed in classrooms are because of the fact that the original sin is being a white European. If you are a white European who's nationalistic in any way, who doesn't prescribe themselves to the multicultural progressive future, then you will end up at Auschwitz. Even though Schindler's List is not set in Auschwitz, most people don't even realize that it's based on a work of fiction that was a book that was presented as a work of fiction because of the fact that it's shown in black and white with lots of shaky cams and it's presented almost like a documentary. People assume that it's based on a real story. It's a work of fiction inspired by real events. People also don't even realize that the camp that it's set in was just a concentration camp, not a death camp. So at the camp that it was set at, it wasn't even supposed to be gas chambers or anything like that. But it's very similar to the way that Adolescence right now, the creators of it are being told, are going and doing these interviews where they say it's based on numerous real stories. It's based on these real stories. And it might get 20, 30 years from now to the future where people are presenting it as if it is an almost factual retelling of a real story so that people can know that your original sin is being a boy who was willful and tried to have agency in his own life when you should have just given yourself over to the state.
Well, and one of the great tragedies of modernity, because when you look at like what is one of the, I guess, the buried premises in, the social ills we see with the gender stuff, with replacement migration, it's the idea that people are fungible, that a person is an exchangeable unit. You can swap out one for another regardless of any of their, specifics. It's sort of the extreme logical conclusion of, egalitarianism. And what that's done to both men and women is pushed them out of their historic place in society and immiserated both of them. So if you look at, what does the regime's woman look like? Well, it's effectively a woman pretending to be a man, either literally, right, in the case of the, shall we say, hormonally reassigned, or
Or the girl bosses, Charlize
exactly.
Theron taking down multiple men who all weigh 100 pounds more than her, 5 inches at least taller than her, but she can take them down because she's a girl boss.
Well, exactly. And this is like every modern synthetic, like ersatz, it's horrible, right? It's not the same. It has immiserated everyone. And so my point in bringing this up is just to say that, we've seen these people's moral vision to its end. They do not have the moral high ground. They have a vision of the future where everyone is immiserated. And when you see something like this, which is a very cynical way to inject their worldview into kind of the population at large, I think it's particularly interesting because, buried in it, you see, if you're, even a little bit intelligent, right? As I claim to be a little bit intelligent, you can see the things that they would never say out loud, right? They would never explicitly say, the real problem is we don't have complete and total informational control over young men. We need to. We need to effectively outlaw masculinity. But, in their fiction, you see it almost in negative.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's much more that I can add to what you've just said there because you put it pretty clearly.
Well, thanks, man. And conveniently enough, we are fast approaching time. I know I jumped straight into this. I didn't give you a chance to, give your plugs. But if people want to find more of you, Harry, how can they do so?
I'm sure they already know, but you can find me at lotuseaters.com, where you can find our daily podcasts and premium content that we produce. We also have the YouTube channel, Podcast Lotus Eaters, where the podcast clips go out. We have another channel called Lotus Eaters Daily, where we put out shorter, direct videos straight to the camera, where we'll talk about very specific subjects that interest the presenters every now and again. So please check out all of that. And if you're interested in getting a subscription on the website, I've got a fair back catalogue of material. Kind of a lot of it is analyzing media. I did a series looking at the career and work of Stanley Kubrick with Josh and Proper Horror Show, who's also got a great YouTube channel. I did a video talking about the Rodney King riots and the depiction of the brief discussions of them in American History X, that film, and how it's trying to manipulate the audience through the perception that's given of that. You can check out all of that. Subscriptions start at £5 a month, so please consider subscribing and supporting the business. It really helps.
Yeah, I highly recommend your work. People should definitely check it out. If you want to find my work, the J.Burden Show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support us, you can either do that directly with the links down in the description, or you could check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching, so you too can be jacked and cool. Or you could head over to North Appalachian Supply for all of your gear needs. Really been happy. I've been out and about quite a bit in the spring, and the stuff I've gotten from them, the dump pouch and a few of the other things, have been very high quality. It's one of us, so head over there, use code J.Burden, support him. Again, Harry, I appreciate it, and everyone at home, keep your head up. A lie can't last forever. Good night. 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 Last forever.